they intended to enslave all Negroes. But it's important to understand that there were three distinct societies. You do have your indentured servants and your slaves, which are white, black, and Indian, and they tended to be on plantations in Virginia and northeastern North Carolina, tobacco plantations, but they could also be in the settlements in the towns. You also had what we call maroon communities, mixed race communities, that were mixed of white, black, and Indian. If you understand the evolution of slavery and slaves running away, you have to go back to 3 indentured servants in Virginia who ran away. 2 were white and 1 was black. And when they ran away and they were recaptured, they were treated differently. The 2 whites were given additional servitude and had to work an additional 5 to 7 years. The black that ran away with them and was their, their friend, was made a slave for the rest of his natural life. But from the perspective of white indentured servants, they were treated the same as slaves. And I'll give you another example from Maryland. A couple of years back, I used it in my colonial American history class, they excavated a garbage pit on a plantation in Maryland, early plantation. During the excavations, they came across a body and stopped all operations. What was the body doing in the garbage pit? So they thought there was foul play. They took the body out, they examined the body, and what they found is that it was the body of a 12 to 13-year-old white female who had, was from the era, was from that period, the 1600s. And that she literally had been worked to death and then thrown out with the garbage in the garbage pit. The point is, as slavery evolves and race-based slavery develops in Virginia and North Carolina, we have a tendency to think of it only in terms of black and white. But in early slavery, in the first 200 years of colonial slavery, Indians, blacks, and whites were treated pretty much the same. They had the same grievances, they had the same hatred for the planter class, and they tended to intermarry with one another, intermix with one another, and they tended to support each other when it came to fleeing the institution of slavery or / indentured servitude. And then finally, we have frontier settlements, which also include free blacks, poor whites, and Indians. And eastern North Carolina was a haven for free blacks, black and white traders, runaway slaves. It was a haven. You see the Great Dismal Swamp there between Virginia and North Carolina? There were maroons in there, runaway slaves in there. There were mixed race people in there, black and whites, white folks who ran away from being indentured servants in Virginia because they were kidnapped and brought over illegally anyway. They ran into the swamp. Everybody was running into the swamp. Everybody was intermixing and intermarrying in the swamp, and all of them hated the planter class. Then you got the Quakers there who feel they're being mistreated by the Anglicans. So this was a real mix of different kinds of people who had different attitudes about their position and their status in the colonies. Okay? So you can see in this map here all these things being played out. You got the maroon communities in the center of white settlements that are moving down from Virginia. You got the communities of slaves and indentured servants on these plantations that are coming into North Carolina. And then you got the frontier where the Indians are still in control, and you have the Tuscaroras in particular, because most of the northeastern Indians and eastern Indians have been eradicated. And so you have people who are running to these Indians, slaves, African slaves, white indentured servants, former Indian slaves, or Indian slaves, all running to the frontier, all running to the Tuscaroras. They're absorbing and taking them all in, and they're refusing to give any of them back to the white colonists who are in northeastern North Carolina. So that's the growth and development of the colonial period. That's the complexity in the societies that are developing during that era. And the Quakers are in the thick of it, not just in North Carolina, but also up in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia, and they are on good terms with what we call the Six Nations, on good terms with those native peoples that they are encountering and that they're interacting with during this particular time period. The next major event that occurs is the Tuscarora War. And we'll touch on that now and kind of move us into the 1800s. The Tuscaroras are a forgotten people in North Carolina. And the Tuscarora War is a forgotten war. And it's a war about slavery. It's a war about Indian slavery. It's a war about African slavery. It's a war about a people who were opposed to slavery and refused to allow their people to be enslaved and refused to return enslaved people to whites. And as a result, they become a blended people, a mixed people. Some would even say almost an African people, because they have such mixtures with runaway slaves and with Africans in North Carolina proper. It's important to understand, and most people don't understand this either, is that prior to the Atlantic slave trade, the African slave trade, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Native Americans, women and children were kidnapped and sold into slavery. Native men, for the most part, particularly in North Carolina, when we talk about the Tuscaroras, they were a major part of this illicit trade. The men were kidnapped and shipped to the British Caribbean, to Jamaica, St. Kitts, Nevis, Barbados, and Native women were kept on Virginia and North Carolina plantations, and they were bred with African men that were shipped up, seasoned African men who'd been broken after being brought from Africa and basically conditioned to be slaves, shipped up to North Carolina and Virginia. And they mixed these people together on plantations in North Carolina and Virginia. Because of the kidnapping and selling of Native American women and children into slavery, this primary thing is what's going to lead to what became known as the Tuscarora War. If you read this advertisement, it's actually from a post office in Boston, Massachusetts, and it's dated for 1713, which is 3 years after the Tuscarora War. And because after the Tuscarora War, hundreds more, thousands more Tuscarora were thrown into slavery and sold into slavery all over the British Empire. But if you go down 2 lines, and you see Negro woman, but then you see Carolina boy, Indian boy, about 11 years old, to be sold at the post office in Boston. So Native people were routinely being enslaved. In 1708, a Tuscarora delegation went to Philadelphia, and they petitioned the Quakers in Philadelphia to allow them to leave North Carolina and move to Pennsylvania with their kin, the Five Nations, to avoid war, because the whites were kidnapping and selling into slavery their women and children. And they wanted to remove themselves from this situation before it led to war. So it is important to understand that the Quakers were engaged. The Quakers were quite knowledgeable about the Tuscaroras, they were quite knowledgeable about the Iroquois, and what the settlers in North Carolina did not know, because they were selling Carolina Indians to Boston and to New York, to Albany, and they were being sold, that these people knew Albany, they knew New York, and as soon as they got off the ship, they ran to the Five Nations. And the Five Nations were incensed, they were enraged. And they said if the Carolina Indian slave trade is not stopped, they would declare war on the entire Atlantic seaboard and burn everything from Albany all the way down to Williamsburg. So it's important to understand that there was a complex network of peoples. The Indians knew the way. They knew the roads to get to their kinsmen, the Five Nations, and their allies, the Delawares, the Nanacoats, the Shawnee. And so there was this informal underground railroad, informal network that already existed, and the Quakers were already a part of it from the 1600s because of their relationship with the Five Nations and friendly relationships with the Indians in the Carolinas. At the start of the Tuscarora War, we have the War Council. Tuscaroras have not been allowed to migrate north to New York yet. Whites are still kidnapping their women and children and selling them into slavery. They have had enough. All of the chiefs of the Tuscarora Nation convene. They plan a war council, and they begin the process of systematically attacking and destroying white settlements in eastern North Carolina. They will kill white men, women, and children. But any Indian, African, or mixed race slaves that they encounter, They will take them with them back to their main settlements in the western and coastal plains of North Carolina, and they will withdraw with them when they leave North Carolina to go to New York State and to Pennsylvania. So it is important to understand, and I'm going to be brief about this one because this is less about the Underground Railroad than it is about the war. I do point out to people that in the Tuscarora War, it wasn't the whites that defeated the Tuscaroras and their allies, it was other Indians that defeated them. And the Indian group that participated in the war the most, that had the largest fighting force, were the Cherokees. So you have Cherokees, you have Creeks, you have Catawbas, you have Yamasees from South Carolina. These Indians were asked for by North Carolina, and they came up to North Carolina. They destroyed the Tuscaroras at the Battle of Fort Neoroka and basically brought the war to an end. And then all of those nations, Cherokees, Creeks, white slavers, Catawbas, Yamasee, took Tuscarora as slaves back to their territories in the mountains of Tennessee and in South Carolina and North Georgia. How does that relate to the Underground Railroad? The Tuscarora want their people back. The Five Nations want their people back. And even though the Tuscarora War officially ends in 1713, the Six Nations, the Tuscarora now have joined the Five Nations, and they've reconstituted themselves as the Six Nations of the Iroquois Confederacy, and they declare war on all of these Indian nations and on the whites in North Carolina, and they come down in force to obliterate all people who participated in this war. They completely destroy the Yamasee in South Carolina. They fight a war of extermination against the Catawbas and the Cherokees in Tennessee. Both the Catawbas and the Cherokees have to come to Onondaga, New York, what is today Syracuse, to sue for peace. It sets off a continental Indian war over Indian slavery, and eventually is as much a part of African slavery as anything else. And these Indians and these slaves know the way. They know 29, they know 52, they know 11 through the valley, they know the roads to get to the north, to get to Pennsylvania, to get to New York State, to get to Canada. And they are coming down to get their people. And they are waging an unending war with these Indians in the southeast and with the whites in North Carolina. Colonial records of North Carolina report that the period after the end of the Tuscarora War, between 1713 and 1717, was more destructive than the war itself. War parties came down, the Mohawks and Senecas, and they burned courthouses, burned farms, destroyed crops, took and kidnapped women and children, and took them back to the lands of the Five Nations in New York State. They wreaked havoc in eastern North Carolina. And only after they negotiated the peace in 1717, establishing the reservation Indian Woods, did we see any calm restored in the region by 1718. So it is important to understand, and I put this image in, this is the battle site of Fort Neoroka for the Tuscaroras. This was a major battle site. It's in Snow Hill, North Carolina. A couple of years ago, the state of North Carolina supported the creation of a memorial to the Indians that were killed there. Because in that final battle, over 900 Tuscaroras were killed, slaughtered in the battle at Fort Neoroka. Men, women, and children were burned alive in the fort in the final assault by the Cherokees, Catawbas, Creeks, and their white allies, and the Yamasees. Even today, still, it is the largest mass grave of Native people anywhere east of the Mississippi River, even larger than Wounded Knee. So it's important to understand that for the Tuscarora people, that defeat and the enslavement of their people, a third of the nation was enslaved and basically put on plantations with Africans in North Carolina and Virginia and shipped to the Caribbean, to Jamaica, Barbados, St. Kitts, Nevis. A third left the state stunned and staggered as refugees back to the Five Nations, where they reconstituted themselves as the Sixth Nation of the Iroquois Confederacy, and others just scattered. They just became wanderers. I tell people the history of the Tuscarora is like taking a mirror and slamming it on a concrete floor or ground, and shards go everywhere. And you can sweep them up and you'll be walking and you'll still step on a piece of glass a month later because you can't get them all put back together again. So it's important to understand that the war was a very significant war, and it led to what we call the Tuscarora diaspora, and it led to the spreading of the Tuscarora throughout the eastern part of the United States along what we call the Tuscarora Trail, which was a trail that they had frequently used to trade with their kinsmen to the north. Now, I'm going to mention the Tuscarora Trail very briefly because I'm sure everyone has heard of the Trail of Tears for the Cherokee, but no one's probably ever heard of the Tuscarora Trail, of what we call the Death Trail, where thousands of Tuscaroras fled North Carolina for the protection of their kin to 5 nations. And on this trail, old men, pregnant women, small children were forced to walk from North Carolina to New York, and they died on the trail. A group of Tuscaroras heading north get to what we call Slide Mountain, New York. Still exists, Slide Mountain, New York. And the old folks couldn't go any further. They told their youth, told their kids, their warriors, we can't go any further, we're going to stay here. We can't go any farther. The warriors ran to Onondaga, to outside of Montreal, Ganawage, Mohawk Reservation, which is right across from the St. Lawrence River from Montreal. And they got Mohawk warriors to come with them, and they ran back from Ganawage down the Slide Mountain, New York. And it's well recorded in the colonial records of New York because everybody knew the Mohawks. And when you say Mohawk, everybody knew the Mohawks. The Mohawks were fierce warriors. Everybody in the colonies feared the Mohawks. They feared and dreaded them because they were known to be fierce warriors. So when the Mohawks start to amass in western New York State and come down out of Canada, it sent panic all throughout the colony of New York. And they were stunned when they saw the Mohawks leave with these old Tuscaroras. They picked them up and put them on their backs, the old men and the old women. They put them on their backs, and they carried them from Slide Mountain all the way back to Ganawage. Most of them, when they got there, converted to Catholicism and became Catholics. And you'll see them recorded in the Mohawk Chapel there, which is a Catholic church. The point is that they knew the way. The Tuscarora Trail, these other trails that the Mohawks will use to come back south to take revenge against those people who had attacked the Tuscarora and destroyed them. These roads, these trails, which end up becoming U.S. routes and state highways, they were very familiar with these roads and these trails. And they used these trails to travel freely through Pennsylvania and Maryland and Virginia and back and forth between Canada and New York and the Carolinas. This is a drawing of an illustration of the Tuscaroras being readmitted to the Iroquois Confederacy. It's courtesy of Chief Elton Green. And you'll see the chiefs across the top and along the side and the longhouse and the various claims.